January 17th, 1940. Camp Beauregard, Louisiana. The air hung thick with moisture and the sharp scent of pine resin. Beneath a canopy of southern oak and cypress, rows of canvas tents stretched across red clay soil, still damp from the previous night's rain. Inside one of those tents, a young sergeant from Nebraska knelt beside a wooden crate, prying open the lid with a crowbar. The nails groaned and gave way. Wood shavings tumbled to the dirt floor. And there it was, gleaming under the pale morning light filtering through the tent flaps. A weapon that weighed less than 25 pounds, fed from a 30-round detachable box magazine, and promised something the United States Army had never truly possessed: automatic firepower in the hands of every rifleman. The sergeant lifted it carefully. The metal was cold, smooth, a foreign in its modernity. It smelled of cosmoline and industrial oil. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the walnut stock, the perforated barrel shroud, the simple mechanical elegance of its design. Around him, other men crowded in: farm boys, factory workers, college dropouts, all of them drawn to this strange new instrument of war. They had been raised on the bolt-action Springfield, a weapon of precision and patience, a rifleman's tool. This was something else entirely. This was the M1 Carbine's older, heavier cousin. This was the Garand's fiercer brother. This was the weapon the old guard called impractical, expensive, and unnecessary. They called it a pea-shooter. They were wrong. To understand the scorn and skepticism that surrounded the M1 Carbine and its related automatic variants in those early days, so one must first understand the world from which they emerged. A world still scarred by the trenches of the Great War, still haunted by the mechanical slaughter of the Somme and Verdun, still uncertain whether another global conflict was inevitable or merely probable. The American military establishment in the late 1930s was a fractured institution, caught between tradition and innovation, between the lessons of 1918 and the realities of 1939. Europe was already aflame. Poland had fallen. France would soon follow. And yet, in the dusty armories and stuffy conference rooms of the War Department, men in starched uniforms still debated whether the average American soldier needed, or could even handle, a semi-automatic rifle. The prevailing doctrine was rooted in marksmanship. The Springfield M1903, and with its 5-round internal magazine and butter-smooth bolt, was considered the pinnacle of infantry small arms. It was accurate. It was reliable. It was, above all, controlled. Officers feared that giving soldiers the ability to fire rapidly would lead to wasted ammunition, poor discipline, and a degradation of shooting skill. The rifle, they argued, was not a tool for spraying bullets into the ether. It was an instrument of deliberate violence, requiring patience, breath control, and respect. But wars are not won by respect alone. By 1940, reports were filtering back from Europe, fragmentary, troubling, undeniable. The Wehrmacht had swept through Poland in weeks, supported not only by tanks and dive bombers, but by infantry squads equipped with weapons that could sustain fire. The MP-40 submachine gun, the MG-34 machine gun, as the Germans had embraced automatic fire at the squad level, creating a doctrine of overwhelming, close-range firepower that shattered defensive lines and demoralized defenders. The French, still clinging to their bolt-action Lebel and Berthier rifles, had been outmatched not just tactically, but volumetrically. They could not answer the storm of lead that descended upon them in the Ardennes. They could not match the tempo of German aggression. The Americans, watching from across the ocean, began to reconsider. The M1 Garand had already been adopted in 1936, a revolutionary semi-automatic rifle that gave American infantrymen a significant edge in sustained fire. But the Garand was heavy, 9.5 pounds unloaded, and its 8-round en bloc clip system, while innovative, was limiting in protracted engagements. There was a growing recognition that the modern battlefield demanded something more. A weapon lighter than the Garand, more powerful than a pistol, capable of automatic fire and simple enough to be mass-produced by the millions. What emerged was not one weapon, but a family of them, designs born from the urgent laboratories of Winchester, Auto Ordnance, and other contractors racing against the clock of impending war. Among them was a weapon that would come to be misunderstood, underestimated, and eventually vindicated in the blood and mud of 100 battlefields. A weapon that German soldiers, encountering it for the first time in the hedgerows of Normandy or the rubble of Aachen, would come to fear with a cold, visceral dread. But in 1940, in that tent in Louisiana, it was still just a curiosity. A pea shooter. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. The Atlantic Ocean roared against the Normandy coast like a living, furious thing. Gray waves heaved and crashed upon a beach choked with obstacles. Wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, tangled coils of barbed wire. Above the waterline, the bluffs rose steep and menacing, crowned with concrete bunkers and machine gun nests. And between the sea and the high ground stretched 200 yards of open sand, a killing field meticulously designed by German engineers to funnel invaders into overlapping fields of fire. At 6:30 hours, the first wave of American infantry stumbled out of their landing craft into chest-deep water. Mortar shells detonated in the surf. Machine gun fire raked the beach in methodical, murderous arcs. Men fell before they reached dry land. Others crawled forward, dragging themselves through the sand, weighed down by sodden uniforms and 70 pounds of equipment. The air was thick with smoke, salt spray, and the sharp, metallic stench of explosives. Screams were swallowed by the roar of artillery. Orders were lost in the chaos. Among the survivors of that first terrible hour was a staff sergeant from Ohio, a man named Warren, who had trained with the M1 Carbine at Camp Beauregard 4 years earlier. He had carried it across the Atlantic, through the marshalling camps of southern England, and now onto this beach where history was being written in blood. The carbine was wet, caked with sand, but still functional. He pressed himself against the base of a wooden seawall, breathing hard, ears ringing from a near miss that had torn apart the man beside him. Around him, the soldiers huddled in whatever cover they could find, behind knocked-out vehicles, in shallow craters, beneath the bodies of the dead. The German machine guns never stopped. Warren knew they had to move. To stay on the beach was to die. But the bluffs were 30 meters away, and between them and salvation was open ground. He looked at the men around him. Boys, really. Most of them younger than 25. Their faces pale and streaked with sand. Their eyes wide with something beyond fear. Something closer to shock. He needed to give them a reason to move. He needed to show them it was possible. He rose to a crouch, carbine in hand, and ran. The first burst caught a German soldier leaning out of a trench line just below the bluff. The .30 caliber rounds punched through Feldgrau wool and flesh with mechanical efficiency. Yet the soldier dropped without a sound. Warren kept moving, firing in controlled bursts, 3 rounds, 4, never more than 5. The weapon kicked lightly against his shoulder, manageable even at a sprint. He reached the base of the bluff, pressed his back against the earthen slope, and scanned for targets. More Germans were moving in the trenches above. He could hear their voices. Sharp, clipped syllables barked over the din. Behind him, other soldiers were rising, following his lead. The seawall became a launching point rather than a grave. Men surged forward in ones and twos, rifles and carbines blazing. The volume of fire shifted. What had been a one-sided slaughter became a firefight. The Germans had not expected this. They had been told that the Americans were soft, undisciplined, more concerned with comfort than combat. Yet they had been assured that their defensive positions were impregnable. that the Allies would be thrown back into the sea within hours. They had expected to face soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles, weapons requiring deliberate, slow-paced fire. What they encountered instead was something different, a sustained, relentless torrent of automatic and semi-automatic fire that poured from the beach in waves, overwhelming their ability to respond. In the trenches and bunkers above Omaha Beach, German infantrymen crouched low, hands pressed over their ears as rounds snapped and cracked overhead. They had been trained to time their return fire to the rhythm of enemy bolt actions, wait for the pause, then rise and shoot. But there was no pause. The Americans fired continuously, reloading in seconds, advancing under their own covering fire. Yet one squad would fire while another moved, then they would switch. It was a doctrine of suppression and maneuver, and it was devastatingly effective. A young Gefreiter from Bavaria, Klaus, huddled in a communication trench behind a concrete pillbox, watched as his platoon leader was cut down trying to reposition an MG-42. The machine gun had jammed, a rarity, but catastrophic when it happened. Without its suppressive fire, the Americans advanced rapidly. Klaus raised his carabiner 98K, a fine weapon by any measure, and fired once. He worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered a new round, and fired again. By the time he had fired his fifth shot, the Americans had closed half the distance. He could see them now. Figures in olive drab, moving fast, weapons spitting fire. One of them carried something Klaus had never seen before. It was smaller than the Garand most Americans carried, lighter, more compact, but it fired with a speed and ferocity that seemed impossible for something so small. The soldier wielding it swept it across the trench line like a man hosing down a garden, and men fell in sequence, struck before they could react. Klaus dropped his rifle and ran. They called it a pea shooter. The nickname had stuck during the early days of the war, born from a combination of skepticism and misunderstanding. The M1 Carbine, with its .30 caliber cartridge, smaller and less powerful than the .30-06 round fired by the Garand, was dismissed by some as inadequate for serious combat. Compared to the heavy rifles carried by most armies, it seemed almost toy-like. Its lightweight design and short barrel gave it an air of impermanence, and as though it were a stopgap measure rather than a true weapon of war. But that perspective revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of its purpose. The carbine was never intended to replace the Garand. It was designed for soldiers who needed a weapon more effective than a pistol, but less cumbersome than a full-sized rifle. Officers, radio men, mortar crews, vehicle drivers, paratroopers. It was meant to provide mobility and firepower in situations where every ounce mattered. And when fitted with a selector switch and a 30-round magazine, transforming it into the M2 variant capable of fully automatic fire, it became something else entirely. A personal defense weapon with the punch of a submachine gun and the range of a rifle. German soldiers, encountering it for the first time, did not care about its official designation or intended role. Yet they cared only that it killed efficiently and that the men who carried it seemed to fire endlessly. August 12, 1944. Mortain, France. The hedgerows of Normandy were a nightmare of green shadow and sudden violence. Ancient earthen berms, overgrown with centuries of bramble and oak, divided the countryside into a maze of narrow lanes and small fields. Visibility was measured in yards. Every hedgerow could hide a machine gun nest. Every corner could conceal an ambush. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, used the terrain to devastating effect, turning every advance into a grinding, claustrophobic battle. An American rifle platoon, part of the 30th Infantry Division, moved carefully down a sunken lane. The men were exhausted, faces gaunt from weeks of continuous combat, uniforms stiff with dried mud and sweat. Yet they had been fighting since D-Day, pushing inland one bloody hedgerow at a time. Every man carried the weight of too many close calls, too many friends lost. At the front of the column, Corporal Hayes carried an M1 Carbine, the fully automatic variant. He preferred it to the Garand for this kind of fighting, close, sudden, requiring quick reflexes. The carbine was light enough to swing fast, short enough to maneuver through dense brush, and when the selector was flipped to full auto, it could empty a magazine in under 3 seconds. In the hedgerows, that kind of instant, overwhelming firepower could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. They reached a junction where the lane opened into a small field, perhaps 50 yards across. On the far side, another hedgerow rose like a dark wall. Hayes raised his fist, and the column halted. Silence settled over them, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the hum of insects. Something felt wrong. The air was too still. The birds had stopped singing. Then the first shot cracked out. A private at the rear of the column spun and fell, blood spreading across his chest. Chaos erupted. More shots snapped from the far hedgerow, invisible muzzle flashes hidden in the foliage. The Americans dove for cover, pressing themselves into the shallow ditches on either side of the lane. Return fire was scattered, disorganized. They were pinned. Hayes crawled forward, keeping his head low, until he reached a gap in the hedgerow on their side of the lane. He could see movement in the field. Figures in Feldgrau, advancing in a skirmish line, firing as they came. A German counterattack. They were trying to retake the junction, pushing the Americans back into the lane where they could be cut to pieces. Hayes flipped the selector to full auto. He rose just high enough to clear the top of the hedgerow and squeezed the trigger. The carbine roared. 30 rounds left the barrel in a continuous stream, the weapon bucking lightly in his hands. He swept it across the field in a wide arc, not aiming at individuals but at the mass of movement, the advancing line. Men fell. Others dropped to the ground, seeking cover. The momentum of the counterattack stalled. Hayes ducked back down, ejected the empty magazine, and slammed in a fresh one. Around him, other soldiers had rallied, inspired by the sudden violence of his response. They rose and fired, adding their own weapons to the din. The Germans, caught in the open, had no choice but to retreat. They fell back across the field, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead behind. The junction held. In the weeks and months that followed, stories like Hayes's multiplied across the European theater. The M1 Carbine, once dismissed as a secondary weapon, earned a reputation among frontline infantrymen as a lifesaver in close-quarters combat. Its light weight made it ideal for paratroopers who jumped into Normandy and later into Holland carrying as much as they could without being dragged down. Its compact size made it invaluable in urban warfare, where soldiers cleared buildings room by room, needing a weapon that could be brought to bear in tight spaces without snagging on door frames or furniture. But it was the automatic fire capability that truly distinguished it. In the brutal, the close-range battles that characterized the fighting in France, Belgium, and Germany, the ability to deliver a high volume of fire in a short burst could overwhelm an enemy position before they had time to react. It was not about accuracy in the traditional sense, aimed, deliberate shots at distant targets. It was about saturation, suppression, and shock. It was about making the enemy keep their heads down long enough for your squad to advance or retreat. It was about survival. The Germans came to respect it, then fear it, then hate it. October 21st, 1944. Aachen, Germany. The city of Aachen, once a jewel of medieval architecture and imperial history, had been reduced to a landscape of shattered stone and twisted steel. American forces had been fighting for it block by block, house by house, sometimes room by room. The Germans defended every inch with fanatic determination, knowing that this was the first major German city to fall under Allied assault. To lose Aachen was to admit that the Reich itself was vulnerable. The fighting was savage, In the rubble-strewn streets, American infantry squads moved like ghosts, hugging the walls of bombed-out buildings, darting across open intersections under covering fire. German snipers haunted the upper floors of ruined apartments. Panzerfaust teams lurked in cellars, waiting to ambush tanks. Machine gun nests were hidden in the basements of collapsed structures, their fields of fire covering approaches that seemed impossible to cross. Sergeant Warren, yes, the same Warren who had survived Omaha Beach, was now leading a squad through the wreckage of what had once been a residential district. His M1 Carbine, battered and scarred but still reliable, hung from a sling across his chest. They had been ordered to clear a 3-story building suspected of housing a German observation post. Intelligence believed enemy artillery spotters were directing fire from the upper floors. The building's ground floor had partially collapsed, the entrance blocked by debris. Warren's men found a side door, kicked it open, and moved inside. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning. They advanced cautiously, weapons raised, every sense straining for movement or sound. On the second floor, they found them. A squad of Hitler Youth, boys no older than 16 or 17, armed with rifles and grenades, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and indoctrination. For a moment, both sides froze, caught in the sudden shock of proximity. Then someone fired. The room exploded into violence. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness. The crack and roar of gunfire reverberated off the walls. Warren's carbine barked in sharp, controlled bursts. He moved instinctively, muscle memory taking over, sweeping from target to target. The close quarters negated the carbine's lighter caliber. At 10 feet, it was more than lethal enough. Bodies crumpled. The engagement lasted no more than 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the echoes faded, Warren's squad stood alone among the dead. One of his men, a replacement who had joined the unit only 2 weeks earlier, stared at the bodies with a pale, stricken expression. "They're just kids," he whispered. Warren said nothing. He reloaded his carbine and moved to the stairwell. There was still a 3rd floor to clear. And the Germans who survived encounters with American automatic weapons, whether the M1 and M2 carbines, the Thompson submachine gun, or the Browning automatic rifle, carried those experiences back to their units, spreading a grim understanding of what they were facing. The Americans, they realized, had solved a problem that the Wehrmacht itself had been grappling with: how to maximize firepower at the squad level without sacrificing mobility or overwhelming logistics. The German answer had been the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle. A revolutionary weapon that combined the range of a rifle with the automatic fire of a submachine gun. But the STG-44 came too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war. By the time it reached the front lines in meaningful quantities, and the Allies had already established a doctrine of combined arms and overwhelming material superiority that no single weapon, however advanced, could counter. The Americans, by contrast, had flooded the battlefield with millions of semi-automatic Garans, hundreds of thousands of carbines, and a logistical network capable of supplying the ammunition necessary to sustain such firepower. Every American squad could bring to bear a volume of fire that would have required a German platoon to match. In engagements where both sides were roughly equal in numbers and position, the side with more bullets in the air usually won. It was a brutal mathematics of industrial war. February 14th, 1945. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Snow clung to the skeletal branches of fir trees, transforming the Hürtgen Forest into a frozen, monochrome hell. Yet the forest had been the site of one of the most brutal and costly battles in American military history. A grinding, months-long campaign through dense woods and fortified positions that devoured entire divisions. The trees themselves became weapons, as German artillery shells burst in the canopy above, sending showers of wood splinters and shrapnel down upon soldiers below. A patrol from the 78th Infantry Division moved through the snow, their breath misting in the frigid air. They had been tasked with locating and eliminating a German mortar position that had been harassing supply routes for the past 3 days. Intelligence suggested it was somewhere in this sector, hidden among the trees, protected by infantry. Corporal Diaz, carrying an M1 Carbine, led the patrol. He had survived the Hurtgen once before, back in November, when his company had been nearly wiped out in a single afternoon. He had learned the hard way that in this forest, survival depended on speed and aggression. Hesitation was death. They found the mortar position in a small clearing, camouflaged under netting and surrounded by foxholes. The German crew was in the process of adjusting their tube for another fire mission, unaware that they were being watched. Diaz signaled his men to spread out, encircling the position. He waited until everyone was in place, then opened fire. The M2 Carbine's full auto burst shredded the netting and cut down 2 of the mortar crew before they could react. The rest of the patrol opened up simultaneously, pouring fire into the foxholes from multiple angles. The Germans tried to return fire, but they were caught in a crossfire, pinned from all sides. Within moments, it was over. Diaz approached the mortar tube cautiously, weapons still raised. One of the German soldiers was still alive, clutching his stomach, blood seeping through his fingers. He looked up at Diaz with eyes that held no hatred, only exhaustion. He said something in German, soft, pleading. Diaz didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He called for the medic. There is a peculiar cruelty in war that transcends the immediate violence of bullets and explosions. It is the cruelty of realization. The moment when soldiers, conditioned to see the enemy as monsters or abstractions, are forced to confront their humanity. The Germans who fought the Americans in those final months of the war experienced this repeatedly. They had been told that they were fighting subhuman enemies, and that the Americans were decadent and weak, that victory was inevitable. But the reality they encountered was very different. The American soldier was not a Superman. He was often poorly trained compared to his German counterpart, especially in the early years of the war. He lacked the tactical sophistication and battlefield experience of the Wehrmacht's veterans, but he possessed something that no amount of training or ideology could provide: an unshakable belief in abundance. The American soldier knew that behind him stretched an entire industrial continent devoted to producing weapons, ammunition, food, and vehicles in quantities that defied comprehension. He knew that if his rifle jammed, there was another in the supply tent. If his uniform wore out, there was a replacement waiting. If his unit took casualties, and reinforcements would arrive within days. This knowledge bred a kind of operational confidence that the Germans, scraping the bottom of their manpower and material reserves, could never match. The carbine became a symbol of that abundance. It was not the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. It was not the most accurate or the most feared, but it was everywhere. Drivers carried it, radio men carried it, officers carried it, support troops carried it. And when the fighting got close and desperate, when the bullets started flying and there was no time to think, those men with carbines could fight back with a ferocity that startled even themselves. April 16, 1945. Nuremberg, Germany. The ancient city of Nuremberg, site of the grand Nazi rallies and the codification of the racial laws that had condemned millions, was now a smoking ruin. Its American forces surrounded it, pounding the defenses with artillery and airstrikes, preparing for a final assault. Inside the city, a dwindling garrison of Wehrmacht regulars, SS fanatics, and Volkssturm militia prepared for a last stand. When the assault came, it was swift and brutal. American infantry, supported by tanks and tank destroyers, pushed into the old city, navigating streets choked with rubble and debris. Resistance was fierce but disorganized. The Germans fought from behind barricades and in the upper floors of damaged buildings, firing down on the advancing Americans with rifles, machine guns, and Panzerfausts. Private First Class Kowalski, a replacement who had joined the 3rd Infantry Division only 3 weeks earlier, moved through the streets with his squad, his M1 Carbine held at the ready. While he had never fired it in combat before, his training had been rushed, condensed into a few weeks of basic skills before being shipped overseas to fill the gaps left by casualties. He was terrified. They turned a corner and came face to face with a German machine gun nest set up behind a pile of sandbags. The gun opened fire immediately, its MG-42 ripping through the air with a sound like tearing canvas. Men dove for cover. Kowalski found himself pressed against the wall of a building, his heart hammering, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The sergeant was yelling something, but Kowalski couldn't hear over the roar of the machine gun. He looked at the carbine in his hands, at the selector switch. He flipped it to full auto. Then he ran. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He simply charged, sprinting across the open street, and firing as he went. The carbine barked and kicked, rounds spraying wildly, most missing their target entirely. But a few found their mark. The machine gunner jerked and slumped over his weapon. The assistant gunner tried to take over, but Kowalski was on them now, firing point blank, emptying the entire magazine in a single screaming burst. The gun fell silent. Kowalski collapsed behind the sandbags, gasping, shaking, realizing only then what he had done. His squad mates rushed forward, securing the position, slapping him on the back, shouting congratulations he barely registered. He had survived. In the final weeks of the war, as the Third Reich disintegrated and German forces surrendered en masse, interrogations of prisoners revealed a consistent theme. When asked what they feared most about fighting the Americans, as many cited not the tanks or the artillery or the air superiority, but the sheer, relentless volume of fire. They spoke of battles where the Americans seemed to never stop shooting, where every soldier carried a weapon capable of sustained fire, where the sound of gunfire became a continuous, deafening roar that shattered nerves and morale. The M1 and M2 carbines played no small part in creating that impression. They were not the weapons that won the war. No single weapon ever is. But they were part of a larger system, a doctrine of firepower and logistics that overwhelmed the Axis through sheer material and industrial superiority. They represented a philosophy of war fundamentally different from the German emphasis on tactical brilliance and individual marksmanship. The Americans believed that if you put enough bullets into the air, as some of them would hit, and if you could keep shooting longer than the enemy could, you would win. It was not elegant. It was not poetic. But it worked. May 8, 1945. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The war in Europe ended not with a climactic battle, but with exhaustion. German units, surrounded and cut off, surrendered in waves. The roads were clogged with prisoners, trudging west toward American lines, preferring captivity under the Western Allies to whatever fate awaited them in the east at the hands of the Red Army. In the city of Pilsen, American soldiers of the 16th Armored Division accepted the surrender of an entire German corps. Thousands of men laid down their weapons in orderly piles, rifles, machine guns, pistols, grenades. Among them were Carabiner 98 KS, the pride of German infantry for decades, now stacked like cordwood, their bolts removed and set aside. An American lieutenant supervising the disarmament walked among the surrendering Germans, noting the condition of their equipment. Many of the rifles were well maintained, still functional despite years of hard use. But the men who had carried them looked hollow, defeated not just militarily, but spiritually. They had fought for a cause that had promised them greatness and delivered only ruin. The lieutenant paused beside a young German soldier, perhaps 19, who was placing his rifle on the pile. The boy's uniform was too large, his face too thin. He looked up at the American officer with eyes that held no defiance, only weariness. "Nice rifle," the lieutenant said, gesturing at the carabiner. The German boy nodded, understanding the English. "Yes, a very good rifle." The lieutenant patted the M1 carbine slung across his chest. "This one's not bad either." The boy glanced at the carbine, then back at the pile of discarded weapons. "You have many," he said quietly. "We have nothing." The lieutenant had no response to that. He simply nodded and moved on. Epilogue. There is a photograph, taken in the summer of 1945, that captures something essential about the end of the war in Europe. It shows a group of American soldiers, dirty and exhausted, sitting on the steps of a bombed-out building somewhere in Germany. Their uniforms are caked with dust. Their faces are gaunt, but their eyes are alive, bright with the knowledge that they have survived. Leaning against the wall beside them are their weapons: Garands, carbines, Thompson submachine guns. One soldier holds an M1 Carbine across his lap, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. The weapon is scarred and worn, its stock dented, its finish dulled by months of hard use. But it is still functional. It has done its job. The Germans had called it a pea shooter. They had dismissed it as inadequate, unworthy of serious consideration. But on the beaches of Normandy, in the hedgerows of France, in the shattered streets of German cities, it had proven itself again and again, not through overwhelming power or perfect design, but through availability, adaptability, and the willingness of the men who carried it to use it without hesitation. The carbine was a weapon of democracy in the most literal sense. It was not reserved for elite units or specialist troops, but it was issued to anyone who needed a weapon lighter than a rifle but more effective than a pistol. It was carried by clerks and cooks, by medics and mechanics, by men who had never imagined themselves as warriors until history demanded it of them. And when the moment came, when the enemy was close and death was imminent, it gave them a fighting chance. That, perhaps, is the true measure of a weapon's worth. Not how many enemies it kills, but how many of your own people it keeps alive. The M1 and M2 carbines kept many alive. They were called pea shooters. They were anything but. They were instruments of survival, tools of a democratic army that believed every soldier deserved the means to defend himself, regardless of his role or rank. Yes, they were symbols of an industrial power so vast and so relentless that it could afford to arm even its support troops with weapons that other nations reserved for front-line combat soldiers. And in the end, that made all the difference. The German soldier who laid down his carabiner in Pilsen was right. The Americans had many. The Germans had nothing. And that simple, brutal arithmetic decided the fate of nations. The war was over. The weapons were stacked and counted and eventually melted down or stored away. The men who carried them went home, carrying other burdens now. Memories, scars, the weight of things seen and done. But the lesson remained, inscribed in the history of those bloody years. Never underestimate a weapon, or a nation, that others dismiss as inadequate. Sometimes a pea shooter is all you need to change the world.